Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on funding vocational education, the F word. We're pleased to have many of you in the room with us today to talk about it. Ko Catherine Hall tōku ingoa. I'm the Executive Director at ConCOVE Tūhura, and I'm pleased to be hosting this important kōrero with you all. As we look at the future of vocational education, funding settings are incredibly important. They support learners, providers, employers, and the industries that rely on a skilled workforce. After years of reform, we know that change fatigue is real, but we also know that the current system isn't working well enough for everyone. In today's session, we're walking you through a new discussion paper which recommends 5 practical, system-compatible changes to improve vocational education funding and enhance delivery. This is an information session, and at the end, we're inviting you to make a submission on the draft recommendations. It's a little bit different from what we would normally do. Normally we would do a piece of research and take it back out to you as a complete piece. This time we really would like your feedback. And the feedback is going to help shape the final recommendations. We've included a link in the chat to the paper and to the very simple submission form. We will also include time at the end for questions and answers, and you're welcome to pop any questions into the chat as we go. They're going to pop up here on my screen and I'll be able to address them. In a moment, we're going to take you through the 5 recommendations, what they aim to address and why they matter. So let me introduce our speakers. We have Brendan Mashewski from Mashewski Consulting and Roger Smythe, Education Policy Consultant. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Let's get into it. Brendan, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Catherine. So, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Brendan Mashewski tōku ingoa, no porirua hau, but my family's really Waikato Taranaki people. I'm an education consultant and I've been working on tertiary education policy, funding and regulation for about 30 years now. Gulp. Roger.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Roger Smythe aho. I too am an education consultant and I've been working in tertiary education for around 40 years. So I have a lot of experience with funding systems, particularly in New Zealand, but also in overseas countries.
And I'm sure Roger and Brendan will be known to many of you. We've got to kick into it now. Can you start, Brendan, by giving us some background on the paper and how it came about?
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. So perhaps if I could start with an observation Roger and I shared as we were walking in today. The Centres of Vocational Excellence, your organisation, alongside Food and Fibre, I think have really made a remarkable contribution to helping us truly understand vocational education. You've identified clearly what's working, but perhaps more importantly, you've shone a spotlight on what needs to change. So when your team asked us to look closely at the funding system, we recognised it immediately as a real opportunity because from our conversations with many of you in the audience and more generally, it was evident you saw firsthand how the current funding arrangements limit what's possible, holding back the potential of our vocational education system. What we've done with this research is bring together Roger's extensive expertise in international models of tertiary education funding and combine that with detailed research into New Zealand's unique context. But perhaps most importantly, we've listened closely to people like those of you in the audience, almost 50 people who live and work daily with the practical impacts of our funding system. You've shown us clearly what's missing, the opportunities lost for employers, learners, and ultimately our wider society.
Thanks, Brendan. So great overview. We're going to walk through the 5 recommendations from the paper in a moment, but first I just wanted to make a note that the 5 recommendations aren't individual recommendations of tweaks that we could do with the system. The recommendations are meant to be carried through as a whole. I don't necessarily agree with them all. Perhaps you might not also, you may also disagree, and that's why we're inviting you to give us your feedback through the response mechanism. But we're going to head to you now, Brendan, and we're going to ask you to just talk us through the people-centred approach to learning support. What do you mean by that?
Thanks, Catherine. So right now, New Zealand's vocational education landscape is filled with various preparatory and transition programs. Youth Guarantee, Māori and Pacifica Trades Training, Te Puni Kōkiri Cadetships, unemployment programs through MSD. Each of these was created with excellent intentions, but what we've ended up with is a scattered, fragmented system.
And that's exactly what we found in the apprenticeship policy paper that
Yeah.
we talked about very recently with Alex and Sarah.
Yeah, and certainly that work has informed a lot of our thinking in this space. So many of you in the audience have been able to find ways through that complexity. I like to think about it in terms of a patchwork quilt. You've pulled together a lot of disparate pieces to try and make something work, but honestly, you shouldn't need to do that. We shouldn't have a system that's so complicated, so disconnected, and frankly, so confusing. And it's not a trivial problem. You know, for learners, especially Māori, Pacific peoples, women, disabled people, or those facing any kind of social and financial obstacle during their study and training, this confusion often leads directly to dropping out or missing critical career milestones. We've unintentionally built a system where many who most need support struggle hardest to access it. There's a better approach, we think, that's already demonstrated success in New Zealand. Approaches like whānau ora and enabling good lives. These programs focus on coordination, holistic support, and personalisation. They understand that people live full, complex lives requiring tailored, cohesive solutions.
I'm just going to interject there and ask for, if you could just describe for us what you mean by a people-centred approach in this context. What does that actually look like for learners in practice?
Sure.
Yeah.
So we think our proposal is straightforward but potentially transformative. So we're proposing a system of dedicated navigators, known as kotuhono or kairahi, who walk alongside learners throughout their educational journey. So these navigators aren't just career counsellors, they're integrators, connectors who bring together resources from education, social development, Māori development, wherever those resources might exist, into some kind of seamless, unified network. So you can imagine each learner equipped with their own personalised budget, giving them access to the support they need precisely when they need it. Things like transport subsidies, childcare, literacy training, mentoring, culturally responsive guidance, whatever is required. It's support that's adaptable, responsive, and deeply personal. We'd see these navigators embedded directly within tertiary institutions, iwi organisations, and local community providers. We think that our whānau ora providers would be obvious places. They wouldn't just understand policies, they'd understand the communities, cultures, and lived realities of the learners they support.
It's really interesting and very helpful. Thanks, Brendan. What do you think then would be the key benefits if we moved to a more people-centred approach?
Well, we know from TEC's learner success work and research into issues like placement poverty that access to the right kinds of support is the first best thing we can do. So if we get that right, we think we'd likely see significant improvement in progression to higher levels of vocational education, better completion rates, and learner retention. You know, consistent tailored support doesn't just help people start training, it helps them finish. Secondly, we'd dismantle barriers, financial hardship, transportation challenges, inadequate mentoring that currently block smooth transitions from education to secure, meaningful employment. This isn't abstract, it's concrete real-world impact for people. And then third, we'd address systemic inequities. So Māori and Pacific learners, disabled individuals and women would all benefit from integrated and responsive support explicitly designed to overcome historical disadvantage. And looking beyond individual benefits, these outcomes have implications for society and the economy. High completion rates mean a more skilled workforce, ready for sectors needing workers, like construction and infrastructure. Long term, we'd reduce reliance on welfare, build stronger, more resilient communities, and foster an economy that's genuinely inclusive, an economy where opportunity isn't dependent on where you started. Shifting to this people-centred approach isn't just a moral imperative, it's a strategic one. We're not just helping individuals, we're fortifying our communities, industries, and society. It's about building an education system that reflects the complexity and humanity of the people it serves.
And really very similar to model to what's run in Australia through the apprenticeship support network. I mentioned earlier that we talked about our webinar on policy settings for apprenticeships and that this has informed some of this work. That session is recorded and available on our ConCOVE website, so we encourage you to please go and take a look at that. We're moving on to the second recommendation, and that's about devolved decision-making. Roger, talk us through it.
Thanks, Catherine. Now, most decisions about vocational education and training funding in New Zealand happen centrally from Wellington. Now, there's a logic behind this. Centralised decisions aim for consistency, for efficiency and clarity, and the governments have to manage their financial risks, so it makes sense to ministers to keep the control in one place, in one system, so they can intervene directly when they need to. But here's the thing. New Zealand is not one homogeneous place. Each region faces its own distinct challenges and opportunities, its own economic realities. So centralised control will often miss those nuances and create a frustrating mismatch between the training provided and the skills that are needed on the ground. You think about this from a local business perspective. So employers frequently find themselves desperate for skilled workers, but local training programs sometimes don't reflect their needs. And learners also experience that disconnect. They invest their time and their resources into training that sometimes doesn't align with the local job opportunities. And for regions, the consequences are broader. Growth stalls. Infrastructure projects are delayed. Housing developments can't fully take off because the skilled workforce simply isn't there.
Yeah, you've outlined the challenges there, Roger. So what can we do about it? What are your thoughts on how we can start to address the problem?
So what we're proposing is more decentralisation of decision making. Now, this principle, which is called subsidiarity, is straightforward. Decisions should be made as close as possible to where the impacts are felt and to where there is the best and most complete information on what's needed. So what we propose is that local and regional authorities, iwi groups, industry representatives and education providers would gain a measure of control over training investment decisions. They would still operate within broad national policies set by central government, but they would have autonomy to pinpoint specific skill priorities, to allocate funds to programs and to integrate their decisions seamlessly with the local economic and infrastructure strategies. So this approach is not untried. International examples such as in the UK and in Australia, the city and regional deals have shown remarkable success. So by embedding workforce development directly into regional economic plans and infrastructure initiatives, these areas have experienced more targeted, more efficient training outcomes. So for New Zealand's construction infrastructure sector, our proposal would mean national planning frameworks such as the National Infrastructure Plan would explicitly include vocational training as an essential component. Then industry skills boards would have tangible, meaningful influence over funding decisions, and that would ensure that training aligns with regional industry needs.
And what do you see then as being some of the key benefits for learners and for local industry if we move towards this more devolved approach?
Right. Well, first, regions would address their local skills shortages with training programs more responsive to local demand. And learners would then graduate with qualifications that are well matched to local employment opportunities, making them valuable to regional economies. Second, regional economic growth would strengthen and skilled local workforces would attract investment, support sustainable development and reduce the reliance on imported labour. And third, this approach involves iwi and Maori businesses enhancing outcomes for Maori learners and their communities. So by aligning vocational training more closely with Maori economic and social aspirations with Maori businesses, we foster genuine, sustainable growth that benefits everyone. Ultimately, devolved decision-making isn't just good administrative strategy, it's a way to empower communities, to strengthen regional economies and to ensure that vocational training serves the diverse realities of New Zealand.
Wow, thanks, Roger. We're cracking through and we're up to the third recommendation I'm going to throw to you in a moment, Brendan. But the recommendation looks at strengthening the investment approach. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, Catherine, the way we fund vocational education in New Zealand, it's far too short-term and unpredictable. It's really holding the whole system back. So at first glance, funding based mainly on annual enrolment seems really clear, simple, accountable. But beneath that simplicity, there's real uncertainty. Providers find themselves constantly juggling budgets, unsure if they'll have the money they need year to year. Education isn't like some other businesses. You can't just pivot mid-year or stop a course halfway through. Once learners enrol, providers commit resources whether student numbers stay stable or not. This uncertainty creates an environment where innovation suffers. Providers hesitate to invest in new programs, specialist staff, or essential equipment because they're worried the funding rug could be pulled out from under them. That directly impacts the quality of graduates entering our workforce. We know that government likes to be able to shift funding around within a year. It gives them short-term flexibility to respond to changing demand. But actually, we think that just buys more pressure and stress in the system later on. And we've really seen that play out in the polytech sector over the last 2 decades. We're proposing something different, shifting to a strategic multi-year investment model, something more akin to how the system was originally intended to work. So instead of just counting enrolments, funding would reward meaningful outcomes like learner success, employment results, industry alignment, and reducing inequalities. We recommend guaranteed funding for up to 5 years for high-performing vocational providers. The stability would empower providers to innovate confidently, invest strategically, and align closely with industry needs. Ultimately, we'd argue that stable funding means better trained graduates, stronger industries, and a fairer vocational education system. It's not just about funding, it's about investing for a collective future.
And I know that industries like plumbing and electrical, for example, have been calling very loudly for more innovation in our systems at the moment. So you outlined the challenges. Can you give us some examples of what a multi-year investment model might be able to achieve, and is that possible under the current funding system?
Well, I mean, a lot of what we're proposing to do here is really plugging into existing arrangements and trying to extend them and really realise the benefits. So with a stable multi-year investment model, we'd see providers being able to plan with confidence, invest in specialised facilities and staff, and create innovative programs without fear of budget shocks the next year, the next month. So instead of reacting year by year, they'd proactively address technology shifts, industry changes, and critical skill shortages. For learners, we'd see higher quality training that directly leads to tangible job opportunities, and employers would benefit from graduates who are genuinely skilled and immediately ready for the workplace. Stable funding also helps us address equity issues head on. Providers would have the resources to offer tailored, culturally responsive support, dramatically improving outcomes. Our current short-term approach leaves regional polytechs particularly vulnerable. So they're constantly chasing budget efficiencies, and it really prevents them from effectively supporting workplace-based learning and local workforce needs. We really need to shift from seeing vocational funding as a cost to viewing it as a strategic investment in regional capability.
Yes, we do.
So recent experience really highlights why this matters. So we've had earthquakes in Canterbury, flooding in the Hawke's Bay and Tairāwhiti, the COVID-19 pandemic. These kinds of crises, unfortunately, are becoming increasingly common. And we talk about the need to build resilience into systems. Well, having stability in funding is one way we think we can do that. So it allowed institutions like Christchurch Polytech to quickly adapt to the rebuild after the earthquakes. Without funding guarantees, could they have responded as effectively? This capability across regions is essential as these kinds of disruptions become more frequent. Ultimately, adopting the strategic multi-year investment model means more than simply funding education. It means strengthening regional economies, reducing dependence on temporary overseas labour, and creating a more resilient workforce. We're investing strategically in vocational education through this kind of approach, and that's really about investing in the future of our people, our communities, and our country, and really about underpinning the whole economic system.
And the time is now, right, with Te Pūkenga devolving itself. Okay, we're going to move on to the fourth recommendation, which is a recommendation to increase work-based learner fees. Now, this might be a little bit controversial. Roger, take us through it.
Sure. So currently, fees for workplace-based training in New Zealand are quite low compared with other forms of tertiary education. Now, this might seem, first glance, beneficial for learners, but it creates issues over time. Low fees mean limited resources to adequately support learners during their training. So, essential services such as mentoring, pastoral care, tailored learner support are underfunded and very often overstretched. Many learners, particularly those who face additional barriers, struggle in a training environment without enough support. Completion rates suffer. Far too many capable people leave their training before gaining their valuable qualifications, and our proposal seeks to realign this balance.
So how then would learner support fees specifically help improve support for the learners themselves?
Right. So we recommend introducing a compulsory student services fee, say around $2,000 per full-time learner per year. And because most work-based learners are somewhere between 40 and 50% full-time, that works out about $800 or $1,000 per learner per year. So those fees would be eligible for borrowing through the student loan scheme so that learners would spread the cost throughout their working lives. So why propose a fee increase? The higher learner contributions enhance the resources available to deliver important student support services. We saw in the recent research that Alan Clark did for ConCOVE on training advisors that the training advice function has been under real pressure and often cannot meet learners' needs. More revenue could help, for instance, fund additional training advisors or pastoral care specialists or literacy and numeracy support or other crucial resources that would help learners throughout their education, especially when they're learning on job. Now, a structured, manageable fee would also create an investment and a commitment from learners themselves. Those entering vocational education would do so understanding that they are investing in their own futures.
I guess many people are going to have natural concerns about increasing fees. It's not something that gets received well often. Can you talk about how the loan scheme could support work to make this accessible for all learners?
Sure. Now, we absolutely accept that many people will have that same concern that higher fees might discourage some learners from enrolling. But all the evidence suggests that upfront costs are not a significant deterrent from participation in training, especially when there's no cash constraint, that is, if those costs can be met through the loan scheme. So the reasons that people train or enter training are complex. They have their origins in their early lives. Finance is rarely a significant deterrent. Plus, learners benefit from their training. They end up with better, more satisfying, more stable careers, and those with training have better social outcomes. Because they benefit, there is a case for them to meet part of the cost. Now, we always want more people to pursue careers in the construction and infrastructure industry, but we're not doing enough now to support the ones already in the pipeline. And with enhanced support services funded by that increased contribution, learners who do enroll will receive better guidance, mentoring, support, and that means higher completion rates, better employment outcomes, a more confident and skilled workforce overall. And employers would benefit because they would gain graduates who are better supported, better trained, more work ready. This would reduce the need for post-training supervision and top-up training, and it would improve overall workforce productivity. Increasing learner fees in a structured, supported way is about creating a vocational education system that is robust, credible, and genuinely capable of meeting New Zealand's workforce demands.
Okay, you've talked me round on that one. Thanks, Roger. Before we look at the fifth recommendation, I'm just going to encourage you, please, to pop your questions into the chat for us. We do have two experts, as you know, here in the room with us today, and we would really love to hear more from you. And I can see Rachel's kicking us off with some questions there. Thanks very much, Rachel. We'll come back to those in a moment. So the final recommendation, or the fifth recommendation, is to introduce industry training levies. It's a really hot topic right now, but it's not being talked about in the way that perhaps you have proposed in the paper, Brendan. Take us through this one.
Yeah, definitely not. So we're trying to approach this in quite a different way. So introducing industry training levies, we think, addresses one of the most significant challenges facing vocational education. That's the uneven investment by employers in formal workforce training. So right now, only a subset of businesses in construction and infrastructure bear the responsibility and cost of training apprentices and trainees. So meanwhile, many other companies recruit those skilled workers trained by others without contributing to the training system in the same way. That creates something that's called a free rider problem, and it really undermines our sector's ability to sustain a strong and skilled workforce. So what we're proposing is quite different from the provisions in the draft legislation before Parliament at the moment. We think those provisions still make it too hard to get industry support, and they limit what you can do with that money. It's the wrong approach. We should require those levies and then back industry to use the money in ways that make sense for the education and training that they need. So to address the imbalance in resourcing and deal with the free rider problem, we propose introducing a fair and practical system of industry levies that'd have three main components. The first, we suggest increasing the existing building levy paid on construction projects. For example, increasing this levy by less than $1 per $1,000 of project value would raise about $13 million each year, dedicated to workforce training. Second, we propose a levy on foreign worker visas, as we've seen in a number of other jurisdictions internationally. That would be set at perhaps $2,000 per visa application. That would raise about $40 million annually. That ensures that businesses choosing to recruit overseas contribute directly to enhancing local training capability. Finally, we'd recommend introducing a modest infrastructure education and training levy linked to major infrastructure project values. This would reinforce a direct connection between major regional developments and the development of the workforce needed to deliver them.
Hear, hear.
So to ensure fairness, though, we think companies already investing in apprenticeships, training programs, and skills development would receive rebates or offsets against these levies. This approach means that businesses that actively invest in training are rewarded, while those companies currently benefiting without contributing would share responsibility for building that sustainable skills pipeline. We see a real role for industry skills boards in managing the allocation of those levy funds, making sure investment directly supports industry priorities. These funds could do things like finance advanced technical training, improve recognition of prior learning, expand degree-level apprenticeships, and boost support for underrepresented groups. We also think introducing industry levies has other benefits. It encourages businesses to participate in workforce development. It would reduce pressure on those companies already carrying the burden. And it also creates a sustainable industry-owned funding stream that enhances workforce capability, aligns training with demand, and ensures ongoing investment in the future of the construction and infrastructure industry. Ultimately, we'd argue levies of this sort help create a fairer system that benefits everyone, learners, employers, and the wider economy. They ensure that the full sector shares responsibility for developing a skilled, capable, and sustainable workforce. And we think by embracing those changes, we can help build a vocational education system that truly supports our learners, our industries, and our communities.
And all of those that you've talked about exist in one way, shape, or form in many models overseas, right?
Yeah.
Europe, certainly South Africa, around.
There
So
are hundreds
we're
of levies.
not talking about reinventing the wheel here. We're talking about some real practical solutions. But I'm interested to hear from you. How does it differ from what the government's currently proposing?
Yeah, so we think the legislation as it's currently written has three main problems. First of all, it's too hard for industries to sign on to the levy still. It has too many limitations on what the funding can be used for, and it doesn't deal with how levy revenue will be collected. So by all of that, we mean there's a case for these levies to be the default option for industries. There ought really to be a high bar for not having a levy, given the extent of the free rider problem. The legislation also limits the use of the funding to the functions of the new industry skills boards. Those functions are really important, but when you think about the actual needs of employers on a day-to-day basis, qualification reviews are really critical, but they're not the same as developing the training skills of employers for immediate impact. And the legislation doesn't treat the levies as part of an existing system. There's plenty of existing ways that government collects revenue that can be leveraged, but the legislation's really silent on those. At its heart, the legislation is another example of a missed opportunity in how the funding system works. We can look to the Netherlands, where their levy is used to create incentives to train, and we've really taken strong inspiration from that. We think that without that focus on education and training, industry might be forgiven for being a little cynical that the levies, as the legislation imagines them, are a way for government to reduce its contribution to the core infrastructure the system needs to operate through the functions of the ISBs.
Not intended that way. Yeah. So, industry buy-in, though, is always going to be really, really critical. How supportive do you think industry would be of this levy? I've heard multiple different responses to that question. from the electricians, the civil contractors, and the plumbers, for example. Yeah. What are you hearing from them so far?
Well, we absolutely acknowledge industry buy-in's absolutely crucial. And from our conversations so far, I think we've detected a cautious optimism mixed with some really clear expectations. So one of the things that you'd observe generally about vocational education is that the centrality of employers is particularly underplayed in how we've designed the system and how we approach education and training at this level generally. So employers broadly agree the status quo, where some businesses carry most of the training burden, is unsustainable. But they've also signalled that for levies to gain meaningful support, we need a fundamental shift, not just in how much we invest, but what we invest in. That means linking levy funds directly to strategic outcomes like regional decision-making, stable multi-year funding models, and better learner support systems, exactly the kind of changes we're advocating. And making sure employers see direct return from the funding they provide through access to better support for them to improve how they train, and the other offsets and rebates to acknowledge the costs they incur, which we've already spoken about. Now, employers certainly worry about bureaucracy involved in collecting a levy, but what we are proposing uses existing mechanisms so that the gathering of the levy can happen largely seamlessly. We shouldn't shy away from the fact, though, that we'd need legislation to make these things happen and make sure the money gets to the right place at the right time. One other key point is that we shouldn't just tip money into the system without looking at how the policy, rules and regulations that shape what and how education and training is delivered. Crucially, employers are also calling for a simple, more flexible regulatory framework for tertiary and vocational education and training, which is why we think there needs to be a regulatory review of how the system operates. We though think that if we align all these reforms, making the system less cumbersome and more responsive, we'd see stronger industry commitment, ensuring the levies are not viewed merely as costs, but as genuine strategic investments in their own businesses, in the workforce and the collective economy.
Leading to what we've found in many parts of ConCOVE's work, some form of national strategy or national approach. Sure. Thank you both. We've been through the 5 recommendations. We're going to open the floor for some questions, and they are coming through. Thanks very much. I'm going to pick a couple from here, and then we've also got one on the screen that's come through as well. So from Rachel's given us a couple of questions. Given the lack of a financial barrier, would you recommend removing fees-free initiative to reallocate toward other funding channels?
The current fees-free initiative seems to me to be a real dead weight expenditure. I think that it would make a lot of sense to phase that out. From my point of view, sooner the better.
And just picking up on another one of Rachel's questions, did you consider capital intensity of the sector at all? Treasury have published some work this week noting the labour intensity of New Zealand across all industries. Capital utilisation and currency of equipment in the sector is an ongoing challenge to ensuring that graduates are industry ready. Yeah, that's a really good question, Rachel.
Yeah.
Who would like to take that?
I think Roger would like to take
I love that.
We didn't explicitly look at capital intensity. We're dealing with an industry here. We're focused on an industry which is a capital-intensive industry, obviously. So we're certainly looking at the costs overall, but in particular of the training side of it rather than the capital side.
I think it's a really good question and probably one that we could explore some more. Rachel, please make sure that you do respond through the discussion paper and give us that feedback so that we can deal with that directly. I'm going to ask you a question about the funding changes interacting more broadly with the vocational reforms that are happening across the system. Is that going to create more complexity, or are we looking at maybe simplifying and strengthening what's already in place?
Yeah, I think as we alluded to earlier, we're not seeing these funding changes happening in isolation. They really are designed to dovetail directly with the broader vocational reforms that are underway. So, the government's got a range of objectives. One of them particularly is to give industry more influence over vocational education. So what we're proposing to do is shift power and decision-making closer to industry, invite industry to put more skin in the game, and put more expectation on the system. The government wants stable, financially sustainable providers. Well, shifting to multi-year outcomes-based funding directly complements the intent behind the redesign and would give us more stability and more responsiveness across vocational education. The government wants regional leadership. Well, we've proposed devolving decision-making to the regions, aligning directly with that desire to have regions shape education and training, which is intended in the redesign.
Yes.
The government wants better outcomes. Well, taking a people-centred approach coupled with simplification and streamlining of the rules that constrain flexibility to meet learner and industry demands seems an obvious opportunity. So more influence for industry, more stability for polytechs, more focus on learners, what's not to like. So rather than complicating things further, these funding shifts clarify and reinforce the redesign, making the entire system fit for purpose, more flexible, and we think ultimately more effective.
Anything to add to that, Roger?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I think that it is a system that's under change at the moment, and it's suffering from, as you said earlier, Catherine, change fatigue. We think that this kind of approach would be opportune. Needs to the more detailed design work. I think it fits well with many of the themes that have emerged through the reforms, and I think from that point of view, it would be something which the government could pick up on.
And many of the themes that are emerging through ConCOVE's work over the last 3 or so years as well.
Absolutely.
We're moving on to a couple more questions here. A question from Evelyn. Is this research then making a recommendation that student loans should be accessible to work-based learners as it isn't currently?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yes. Currently, some students will pay, or some workplace-based learners will borrow to meet the costs of their off-job component, but on-job training, there is no borrowing for that at all. This would extend the entitlement of students to borrow through to all aspects of the fees of their program.
Great. Thank you for that. And another one from Raymond. How does the panel suggest the construction industry works harder to grow our own expertise and relax industry reliance on overseas labour?
Well, I think what we're proposing is directing more resource into that really critical area of employer capability. So I think we see considerable variability, in how employers support their trainees. That's not to criticise them. It's just that's not the main reason they get up in the morning. It's to build the house or build the dam or build the bridge.
You're channeling Greg there from BCITO, aren't you?
That's right, yes. And so it's not the main focus. But there's a lot that we can do to wrap around support. And we see this in a number of overseas jurisdictions where, the system steps up and it supports businesses and employers to provide the best support they can to their apprentices and trainees. And that's the bit where actually if we can support more of our learners through to completion, it then creates a greater flow of skilled people into the workforce. There's always going to be a place for migrant labour in these systems. It's just a nature of our economy, its size, location, and the opportunities people see overseas. But having improving the efficiency and the outcomes that we get from our current spend through the changes that we're proposing, we think is a real opportunity sitting there.
Great. Thanks very much, Brendan. Rachel's come back in with another question. Thanks,
Great.
Rachel. How would the levy not replicate the issues with the UK levy? Sank small businesses training, massive drop-off in 19 to 25-year-old participation, overall decline in participation that ended up oriented towards senior rather than entry-level jobs.
So there's a lot of particular nuance around the UK system. I give a couple of examples. The UK Treasury, I think, was able to extract some several £100 million of unspent levy because it was a government-owned and controlled instrument. We're proposing much more influence and power for industry in the administration of the levy. There's always going to be unintended consequences and risks that need to be managed. But we think having decision-making closer to the people who actually benefit from it helps minimise those risks and makes the system more flexible and responsive.
hence recommending that the ISBs have a role to play in that future.
Yeah, I think that the way that the British designed it was always flawed, and if you look at other models internationally, what you'll see is that these levies make a real contribution to the effectiveness of the training system.
Okay. Again, we encourage you to give us your feedback through the discussion paper. Brian's come in with a question. Will it support student financing on micro-credentials, which is the norm in other countries? Don't get me started on micro-credentials, but I'll ask Roger and Brendan.
Right. Do you want to start?
Sure. So, I mean, we think micro-credentials are an important part of the overall mix of skill and training provision in the system. Micro-credentials are a real example of, I think, probably orphans in the system. And so in the way that workplace-based training and vocational education is treated differently from other forms of tertiary education, it's got a whole infrastructure around it that makes it hard to engage with. We've got disconnected decision-making, that choice for providers to identify a market need, to develop a micro-credential, get it recognised, and then a separate funding stream that sits behind it just makes it really clunky and difficult to manage and realise, I think, the benefits of it. Part of the reason why we've got that recommendation underlying this about the regulatory review to streamline, simplify those things.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Roger, any thoughts?
No, I agree. I think that micro-credentials are certainly, the greatest value, it seems to me, is in the vocational system where they can act as sort of top-ups, get people extra training, deal with new technology as it arises, and provide additional skills for workers. I think that, as Brendan said, the regulatory review has got a role in smoothing the path of micro-credentials into integration into the wider training system.
And if you are interested in knowing more about the micro-credential review that ConCOVE did within the system, we do have a paper on that, and I'm sure one of the team could pop a link into the chat, or we can send that back out to you a bit later on. I'm going to move on. We've got time for a few more questions. Dave would like to know, Roger, what's your reasoning for removing the fees-free option?
Well, the first thing about fees-free is that all the research shows that nothing changed. Nobody's behaviour was changed by fees-free. The only real change was that the government spent a lot of money. Now, if you look at what happened with learner success, if you look at what happened with learner participation, the impact of fees-free was zero. And so why spend all that money for so little purpose? And I think that's really the main problem, is that it actually was pure deadweight expenditure. And if you look at the system as a whole and you think, well, where's all the need for funding? Why spend it on something which actually has so little effect? And the other point about it probably that's worth making is that because nearly all people who are in the provider-based system borrow most of their fees through the student loan scheme, the financial benefit of fees-free is not experienced at the point when people enroll. It's experienced 6 or 7 or 8 years after the student has completed the qualification and is at that point pays off the loan more quickly, and therefore they receive the financial benefit at the point when they don't need it. It really makes no sense.
Great. Hopefully we answered that one for you there, Dave. Moving now to another question here. Have you received any political support for the recommendations? And how much support have you received from MB, MOE, TEC, etc., if any?
Well, we certainly interviewed officials from those agencies. They weren't speaking on behalf of government or stating government policy, but it did help shape our understanding of the issues and help shape the recommendations. We haven't taken these recommendations for change to anyone in the political sphere. I think part of our approach, first of all, is to have this conversation with you all about the changes we're proposing and to understand, have we missed the mark? Do we need to lean into some of them a bit more strongly? Where are the other opportunities perhaps we've overlooked? And then take that forward as a set of policy prescription, a set of recommendations for others to take forward. And we'd certainly encourage all of you through your own conversations and lobbying that I know you do to bring these opportunities up with those people in the political sphere to support them if you agree.
Great. Question that's come through again a little bit earlier, which I missed, I'm sorry. You argue that increasing fees and using student loans won't significantly deter learners from vocational education. What robust evidence do you have from similar contexts in New Zealand that increasing fees won't disproportionately affect already marginalised groups, particularly Māori, Pacific peoples, disabled or financially vulnerable learners?
Okay. So for a start, most of the international evidence looks at people studying on a provider-based system rather than work-based. But if you look at what happens in vocational education now, there is no evidence that Māori, Pacific, or financially vulnerable people are any less inclined to enrol or to borrow as a result of having a fee where the cash costs can be met immediately through the student loan scheme. There's no evidence in the provider-based system. The only difference here is that we're looking at extending an existing entitlement to a part of the system that doesn't have that entitlement, which is the work-based part of the system. So it seems to me that while there is no particular evidence on the exact nature of what it is we're proposing, that's because it's different and new. Every piece of evidence would suggest that this would have no or almost negligible impact on participation. It would certainly have an impact on the success of learners if it was channeled into the purpose for which we intend it, which is supporting the training advice function. That's something where there is currently what appears to us from all the evidence from the interviews and from the research that was done by ConCOVE previously to be a real problem area.
Thanks, Roger. We've got time, I think, for one more question before we wrap up, and this has come through from Nasim, and I think it's a really interesting question. While looking at the funding issues, did you also look at enhancing the quality of deliverers, i.e. the lecturers, kaiako? Industry pays much more than the lecturers. How would you attract better quality teachers?
Well,
that was a hospital pass.
No, that's always going to be a challenge. And one of the things I think that tertiary education providers are always looking for are people that can step in both those worlds, between the research-led teaching, which is so important to education, but also that currency of professional practice. We'd like to think that with more stability of funding, and frankly, more resource going into the system, there's opportunities here actually to make those roles in tertiary education providers, more interesting, more challenging, more frankly inspiring. We know there's thousands and thousands of people that get up every day to try and transform the lives of apprentices and trainees around the country. This is about trying to wrap as much support through the funding system around that whole system of support that sits for those people so that you can truly see the benefits of the hard work you do every day.
Great. Anything from you, Roger?
No,
Okay. Now, Josh has got a question that's come in, but Josh, we're going to have to answer that after the webinar, and we will share sound bites of the questions that we haven't been able to get to after we finish up today. So thank you, Brendan and Roger, for your insights and for guiding us through the 5 funding recommendations that need to be read as a whole as opposed to individual contexts. Now we need your input. Submissions on the discussion paper are now open, and your feedback will help shape the final recommendations. We have included a link in the chat. Please do share your thoughts with us, and submission closes on the 27th of June. 2025, which is this year. If you've missed anything, don't worry. The recording and slides will be sent to you after the webinar. To everyone who joined us today, ngā mihi nui. Your engagement is crucial to making real progress on a system that better serves learners, employers and industry, and the whole reason why ConCOVE exists. If you have any questions or need any clarification on anything we discussed today, please feel free to contact Brendan directly. Thanks for offering that, Brendan.
Sure.
And finally, if you'd like to stay connected with this kaupapa, subscribe to the ConCOVE newsletter at concove.ac.nz and mark your calendars for Tūhura Te Maramatanga ki ngā Tukanga, our national event on the 20th and 21st of August 2025 in Wellington at Te Papa. We will be showcasing over 15 project outcomes, including this funding paper, and all of the work that we will be showcasing is focused on the future of vocational education in Aotearoa. We hope to hear your voice in the submissions. Thanks very much for joining us. Ngā mihi nui, and enjoy the rest of your day.